to start with a question of why are we seeing more collisions, more crises in the South China Sea than we have in the past? What is the major change that has happened that has caused this? And I think that the answer is actually not freedom of navigation operations, because those have been happening all over the world for over 4 decades. Freedom of navigation operations are not a new invention. What is different is the environment in which they happen, right? So a freedom of navigation operation in US Navy parlance is simply an assertion of rights under UNCLOS, right? It's freedom of navigation through a particular claim that in the US Navy estimation, or the US estimation, is unlawful, and so they're going to go ahead and challenge that claim. The United States does it against their friends. They do it against their allies. Anyone who has in what the United States believes to be an excessive claim under UNCLOS could be subject to a freedom of navigation operation. What is different is the simple amount of paramilitary capability in the South China Sea brought by one country, the People's Republic of China, and that country's willingness to use that in an aggressive way to try to assert its changes to the previous status quo. And this is what I mean by that. I started studying the South China Sea in the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, nobody tried to control the water. There was essentially disputes over features, a reef, a shoal, a rock, an island, right? So we saw a couple of bloody confrontations, say in 1974, in the Paracel Islands, in 1988, at Johnson South Reef, but it was, all of those were centered in on individual features. That's because nobody had the capacity, the capability to try to control water. What we are seeing today is an attempt to control water. And the way I tend to frame this is that this is actually the most successful expansionist project in the past 50 years. People are familiar with Russia's territorial expansion in Eastern Europe, and that has, depending on how you think of it, it can't simply be considered an unqualified success by any means. But China's expansionist project, which has taken place in the maritime space, in the gray zone, through the application of paramilitary maritime force, has actually been remarkably successful. And the way I think of this, let's take, for example, what happened on August 11th. We saw a collision between a PLA Navy ship and a China Coast Guard ship. But we don't often talk about why that happened. The ship that was in the closest proximity, in fact, extremely close to the bow of both ships, was a 44-meter Philippine Coast Guard ship, which was being pursued by both ships and came dangerously close to being rammed. Right? So we had a 7,500-ton guided missile destroyer pursuing a 350-ton Coast Guard ship, along with a large China Coast Guard ship. Why was that happening? Why was there a gray hull, a Navy destroyer, involved in this at all? It's because that Philippine Coast Guard ship was in a place that until about 18 months ago, Philippine Coast Guard ships went all the time. That is, near Scarborough Shoal, maybe about 10 nautical miles away. The reason there was a Navy destroyer all of a sudden getting involved, which had previously not really been experienced, was because this was sort of the laying down of the law for this new regime that was going to say, you can't come here anymore. It was a change in the status quo that we have been tracking at Sea Light about a 30 nautical mile exclusion zone being enforced around Scarborough Shoal since about May of 2024. This one ship, this one Philippine Coast Guard ship, was inside that exclusion zone, and that was what drew out the destroyer. So we are seeing an aggressive change to the status quo around Scarborough Shoal. We have seen an aggressive change to the status quo at Sabina Shoal. We are seeing a maritime expansion, and we're seeing it happen in the gray zone. So what is, now let's talk about cross-regional cooperation. How long are we going to experience maritime expansion in the South China Sea or in East Asia generally? Until, in the estimation of the People's Republic of China, the costs of expansion outweigh the benefits. Clearly, they are not there at this point. The Philippines has tried two innovations to try to, to nibble away at this cost-benefit calculation. One, of course, was the arbitral case that they brought in 2013 and which they won in 2016. And of course, the second has been this transparency project. Having one country do these things, in Beijing's estimation, clearly has not been enough to cause it to say that the costs outweigh the benefits. This is where cross-regional coordination, cooperation is not just timely, it is overdue. At some point, there needs to be enough cooperation so that Beijing concludes that this expansionist project needs to end. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
A lot of trees. I'm going to try to go back to the forest. China signed UNCLOS in 1996. It signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea in 2002. The DOC is a very simple document. It's only got 5 articles in it. China violates 3 of them repeatedly. One is it denies the freedom of navigation to ships operating legally on the high seas within the South China Sea. 2 is it uses the threat and use of force. This is prohibited in the DOC, but it is what else do you call water cannoning and ramming and swarming? All of those are the use of force and the threat of the use of force, and it has failed to exercise restraint. Look, I made this analogy in Vietnam, I'll make it again. I live in Atherton, California, which is a place full of mansions. I have a very small 2-bedroom rental that apparently I can afford with all the CIA money I'm supposed to get. If one of my large neighbors in their mansions begins to move their wall and begins to encroach on my yard, and I can no longer get into large parts of my yard, and then they put large security guards there who push me around and beat me up whenever I try to go out to do my gardening, and then they say, well, why are you causing trouble? Why are you causing trouble trying to go to the place that you went to for generations in your family, and now suddenly you want to go there, but we've taken that now. And by the way, why did you let your wife take a video of it and put it on YouTube? Why are you provoking us? That's the situation of the Philippines today. China has appropriated things that did not used to have and is now blaming the Philippines for provoking it because it took pictures. And I'm sorry, but that is not an acceptable or responsible use of the power that China has. And that is the core of the problem.